Hello, I'm John Weatherstone. I've been asked today to give you a short talk on making compost. Those of you who watch programs like Gardening Australia will know that when any of the presenters go to plant a new plant, the first thing they do is get a bucket of compost and some rock minerals. Over the years I've become very passionate about soil health, and one of the very best things that gardeners can do to improve the health of their soil is to make and to use compost. It not only benefits the soil, but it's amazing how many materials that come out of a normal garden can actually be used to make compost. And apart from benefiting the garden, that's less material going into landfill and less carbon dioxide and methane gases going into the atmosphere. So I'm just going to go through some of the basic methods of making compost, some of the materials that we can put into them, and have a look at some that I've recently made. When we're going to make compost, obviously the first thing we need to look at are the materials that go into making that compost. Commercial compost is very carefully controlled and balanced, but in a garden situation it's very, very difficult to get that balance, and it doesn't matter all that much. One of the most important things to remember is that we have two main groups of materials, often referred to as brown and green. The brown materials are ones that are very high in carbon and low in nitrogen, and the green materials are the opposite. They're very high in nitrogen and much lower in carbon. The other third critical component is water. For many years when we were back on the farm, I tried to make compost and had very little success, and eventually realised it was because I was just putting the materials together and not wetting them, and there wasn't enough moisture there for the bacteria to work. So just to run through some of the materials we can use. The green materials that we'll find in most gardens are prunings like these, and it's amazing how many of these come out of a garden over the course of a year. Behind me you can see this mulcher, which I've put some of these materials through. The finer the material, the quicker it will break down. But if you don't have access to a mulcher like that, you can do a first-class job just with a pair of secateurs and just cut it up into small pieces. That's really all that's needed. Other things that are classified as green materials, which are high in nitrogen, are things like food scraps, but we don't use meat or dairy products because they attract vermin into the compost. Crops which are finished and been harvested, the leftover materials from them, there's a lot of materials that can come out of a normal household garden. The brown materials are sometimes found more difficult to get. Things like sawdust is a terrific source of carbon, straw, cardboard, but not shiny cardboard, but flat ordinary cardboard like used for packing white goods and that sort of thing is another good source of carbon for a compost pile. Most experts agree that in a compost we need a ratio of about 20 or 30 to 1 of the brown to the green. So we need 30 parts of brown to 1 part of green, somewhere in that range. It's not critical. In an ideal world we would have piles of green and piles of brown set aside, and when we go to make the compost we'd put it in that ratio. But in a real life garden situation that's just not possible, because most of us have different materials available throughout the year, and that's fine. The other critical thing is moisture, as I mentioned. If these materials are too brown, the microbes that break down the material and turn it into compost will not work. So it's important. The material, if possible, should be put in shallow layers, and each layer wet as it's put in. The other thing I like to do is to put a little bit of lime, or better still if you've got a wood fire, put some wood ashes in it. Wood ashes, as well as being alkaline, also have quite a bit of magnesium and potassium in them, so they're really good to mix in. The other thing I like to put in, if I can, is some rock minerals and even a bit of blood and bone, which will help to feed the microbes. Another thing that you can do to stimulate the activity is to put some molasses in, but it needs to be no more than a tablespoon to a watering can of water. If you mix it too strong, it actually has a negative effect. So there are an incredible number of variations, but if those basic principles are followed, you'll still end up with good compost. Making compost can be as simple or as elaborate as you really want it to be. Some people obviously won't have room for bins like I've got here, but as I said, it can be as simple or as elaborate as you want it to. The simplest form of making compost is to actually cut the bottom out of a plastic bucket and sink it in the garden, as long as it has a lid to keep the flies and things out of it, and the food scraps can be placed in that bucket in the garden, and the earthworms will come into that, and you can make compost that simply. Probably the next step up is some of the tumblers and that type of compost making equipment that's available. Personally, I've never had a great lot of success with those compost tumblers, but some people have, and certainly that's another option. The setup I've got here is with two bins which have been built out of old pallets. Most of the compost that you'll hear spoken about in gardening programs, they will talk about the importance of air, and this is called aerated compost, and the most common form of making compost. A lot of the bacteria actually need oxygen to work, and so if you're using this type of compost, you need to have good air circulation through it. One of the ways to do that is to actually have material like sticks and bark that leave air pockets through the compost. The other way that the air is actually introduced into the compost is that it's turned fairly regularly, which can be quite labour intensive. As I said, this is by far the most common form that's used. However, a couple of years ago I was taught a different method of making compost, which is called fermentative or anaerobic compost. In this method I actually line the bins with plastic, and the air is actually excluded from the compost. But in order for that to work, you have to actually introduce bacteria which work without the presence of oxygen. The product that I use to get that particular bacteria into the compost is called BAM, B-A-M, which is an anagram for beneficial anaerobic microbes. While it's a little bit more complicated to set up this method, it doesn't have to be turned, which saves a lot of labour. A couple of weeks ago I opened a bin of compost which was ready to use, or almost ready to use, and when I took the plastic off the front, the whole face of the bin was just covered in earthworms. So I'm going to hope that the same is happening in this bin, and we're going to open it and have a look. There are earthworms right down the face there. Look at them. This is some of the finished product from the bin that I opened a couple of weeks ago. I've strained this out, and as you can see, the worms are still here, plenty of them. When I take this material out, because there's a lot of sticks and coarse material that hasn't broken down, I actually throw it onto a sloping mesh screen, and as it runs down, because it's on a slope, all the coarser material stays in front of the screen and the finer material goes through. The coarse material that stays in front of the screen is then put back into the bin, which is alongside, and that becomes part of the next compost. One of the advantages of that is that the bacteria which have helped that compost to mature are then transferred into the other bin, and they actually help to speed up the composting process in the new bin. One of the problems that we often have when we're making compost from our garden weeds and so on is that we don't want to put any material into the compost which is going to create problems for us in the future, and that certainly includes things like weeds with seed on. So that raises the question, what can we do with weeds that have got seed on that are not fit to go into the compost? One of the alternative uses we can put them to is a thing called weed tea. To make weed tea, I've actually set up an old garbage bin here, and we put the weeds, the seedy weeds, into this bin, cover them with water. I actually put a bit of the BAM that I use for the compost in there to increase the activity of the bacteria, and we create basically what's called a weed tea by soaking the nutrients out of these weeds. At the moment I'm also putting our food scraps in here, because often I find if I put the food scraps into the compost it attracts dogs and birds and all sorts of things, so I'm actually putting it in here where it's sealed and nothing can get at it. The liquid is then drained off. In this particular setup I've put a strainer in the bottom so that I don't get any small rubbish coming out, and we drain the liquid out the bottom. And there's all the nutrients out of those seedy weeds. By the time those weeds have been covered with water for some time, the seeds will have been destroyed, and so that material can then go into the compost. Just a warning, it is fairly smelly because it's anaerobic, but we then dilute that a bit so that it has the colour of weak tea and water it on and around our plants, and it's a great liquid fertiliser. So that way there's very little waste needs to leave our gardens. Obviously as gardeners our primary goal is to have healthy and vigorous plants. If we try to fertilise them with artificial fertilisers, it's very, very difficult to get the balance right, because plants need a lot of different nutrients in different balances. One of the great advantages of compost, apart from the fact that it helps hold moisture and nutrients in the soil, is that the bacteria in the soil, in the compost, have a relationship with the plant roots, and they can actually regulate the amount of different nutrients that the plant needs and help the plant to extract that in the right amounts from the soil. So compost has many, many benefits, including moisture retention, providing nutrients, and balancing the nutrients that a plant needs. I have found over the years that compost is probably the most beneficial thing I can do to have a healthy garden.